This is our third video dealing with our module on religion. Let's move on to our learning objectives. There are four. First, we're going to look at the origin and the geographic spread, or diffusion, as we also called it, of our second universalizing religion, and that is Islam. And then we're going to do the exact same thing with respect to our third universalizing religion, and that is Buddhism. There's basically a footnote to our discussion of Buddhism, and that is I want students to understand what I'm going to call the non-exclusive nature of religion in East Asia. If that doesn't make sense right now, let me just kind of hint at what that means. Here in the West, in America, in Europe, in the Middle East, you can either be Christian or you could be maybe Muslim, but you can't be both at the same time. That's not true in East Asia. People can be both Buddhist and Shinto, Confucian and Taoist at the same time. And so it does lead to some kind of unique and peculiar geographies that we'll look at, for example, in a Japan case study. Finally, I just want to briefly look at the world map of religion, and I want to talk about some of the resulting geographic footprints, meaning what is the geography of Christianity? What does it include? What's the geography of Islam? What does it include? And that would be for the contemporary world. So let's begin by talking about Islam. First off, Islam, like Christianity, is a monotheistic faith. It is also a universalizing faith. So it's open to anyone, and therefore it's going to travel quickly and it's going to travel well, just like Christianity. Christianity and Islam are also similar in that they both have origins in what we call the Middle East. The only difference is that the origins of Christianity are here in what is today Israel. The origins of Islam are a little bit further to the south in what is today Saudi Arabia, in the place where Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, was born way back in the 500s AD. So a unique way of looking at this then is that Islam is another Abrahamic, monotheistic, universalizing religion that comes out of the Middle East. So there's actually quite a lot in common between the two. There's also, of course, quite a lot of differences. Now, Islam spread very quickly, and the geography of its spread is, again, there's a lot of detail you don't need to know, but I like to put it this way. It basically spread quickly in concentric rings of expanding influence. So, firstly, the Arabian Peninsula, then areas nearby, ultimately pushing out to the far western part of North Africa and the southern Mediterranean fringe of Europe, well over into South Asia and also Central Asia. Now, there's an interesting little point that I also want to bring up here, and that is this. Notice this final category where it says Muslim after 1300 AD, so relatively recently, just about 700 years ago. And that would include basically the contemporary state of Indonesia and also parts of the Indian Ocean coast of Africa. Notice that both the Indian Ocean coast of Africa and Indonesia face the Indian Ocean. And that kind of leads to an interesting conclusion. Let me tell you what that is. By the time we get to about the 1200s AD, the Indian Ocean had become dominated by Arab traders. And Arab traders basically organized a big trading network on the Indian Ocean, so that all of the coastal port cities facing the Indian Ocean had a strong Arabic influence. The Arabs brought their religion with them. And by this time it was, of course, Islam. And the result is that Islam tends to be really well represented along the coastal areas of the Indian Ocean. And you can kind of see that very well in sub-Saharan Africa, but also over here in Indonesia. Now, another point that I want to make sure that all of you understand is that Islam is younger than Christianity. It's the newest of these three big monotheistic, basically Abrahamic faiths. And so the result might be that it's going to have a somewhat smaller geographic footprint. And it does, but it's a fast-growing religion, just like Christianity. So where are the places today where you see a lot of conversion to Islam? Well, it tends to be in places nearby. For example, here in sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps other parts of Southeast Asia as well. The same thing is true with regard to Christianity. It tends to be spreading as well in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, all of sub-Saharan Africa is an area that a lot of people like to call the zone of monotheistic conversion, just because many individuals are abandoning their old polytheistic faiths and basically embracing one of the two big, fast-growing monotheistic faiths. Let's look at what the world map of Islam looks like today. We saw this map way back in our introductory set of videos. And all I want to show you is this. The closer you are to the site of origination, which is right about here, typically these days that would predict a higher percent who identify as Muslim. And then the farther you get away from that site of origination, Mozambique, Mongolia, or Bulgaria, the percent of the population who identifies as Muslim tends to be much lower. And so there are consequences to the exact geography or diffusion of the spread of Islam. And that is, areas where Islam just recently penetrated tend to be those places that have, expectedly, a smaller percent of the population that identifies as Muslim. Now, one final point. Both Christianity and Islam have, over the course of the last roughly 500 years, become truly global religions. There are Christians and Muslims in every part of the world, and that, of course, is because of things like colonialism, long-distance trade, and also globalization. The same thing is true with respect to Buddhism. So let's talk finally about our third universalizing faith, and that is Buddhism. Buddhism has its site of origination right here, basically in the northern part of what is today India, very close to the border with Nepal. Buddhism has a relationship to Hinduism, and it kind of runs like this. The Buddha was born into a Hindu community, but he took a look around and he didn't really like some of the things about Hinduism that he saw, including reincarnation and the caste system. And so he created a new religion. Eventually it takes on the name Buddhism, and it spreads like wildfire through parts of South, Southeast, and East Asia. So the direction in which Buddhism is most successful is to the east. Contrast that with Christianity, where, if you remember, the direction in which Christianity was most successful is into Europe. So that's basically from the west of its site of origination. So there's almost like a mirror image here with regard to where Buddhism tended to spread after its original advent. Now, I should also point out that Buddhism is technically older than both Christianity and Islam. It goes back to the 5th century BC, so about 500 years before Christianity, and it spread, again, relatively quickly, especially to the east, affecting cultures from Vietnam and Thailand to Malaysia, China, Japan, and even into the north a little bit, what is today Afghanistan and Pakistan, for a very long period of time, perhaps surprisingly, were largely Buddhist. But they've since flipped to Islam as Islam made inroads in that part of the world. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Buddhism and why it seems to have kind of a small geographic footprint, even though it is one of those universalizing religions. It has to do with where Buddhism tended to become successful. It was to the east, in places like China, Japan, and so on. And there's a big difference between the Eastern conceptions of religion and the Western conceptions of religion. In the East, you can mix religions freely. They don't make a mutually exclusive claim on your identity, meaning you can be Buddhist and any other religion simultaneously, which is obviously something you can't do in the Abrahamic monotheistic tradition, where you can either be Jewish or Christian or Muslim, but you can't be all three simultaneously. And I can prove it to you by looking at this map. It's a map of Japan. It shows areas that are overwhelmingly Shinto. That's one of the polytheistic religions of Japan. And if you look here just in this region, you'll see that 80% of the population says, yeah, I'm Shinto. But in the same region, 85% of the population also says, hey, I'm Buddhist. So they're obviously both. And in fact, if you look at this third map here, you can see that through most of Japan, people identify as both Shinto and Buddhist. So that's one of the ways in which the Eastern conception of religion is unique. Finally, I want to look at this world map right here, and it's probably a little too detailed and too fuzzy for any of you to really see it that well, but I want to just highlight some key points. Let's start out with Christianity, because Christianity is the world's largest religion. And if you look, all of these colors right through here, kind of the purple running through the pink, they're all basically different sects of Christianity. And the geography of Christianity is probably no big surprise. It basically corresponds to Europe and all of those places that were brought into the European culture through colonialism. So North America, Middle America, South America, way over here in Australia and New Zealand, all of them heavily colonized by Europe, and where Europeans went, they brought their religion. Islam basically has a somewhat more contiguous geographic footprint. You're basically talking Northern Africa, the Middle East, what we generally call Central Asia, and into parts as well of both India and China. Notice again that you've got that long stretch of Islam that carries down along the Indian Ocean coast of sub-Saharan Africa. That's because of Arab traders dominating the culture of the Indian Ocean. The same thing is true over here in Indonesia. Now, I won't talk about any of the others, but I do want to point an interesting kind of counterfactual point here. And that is, notice that Christianity is dominant along the Atlantic coast of sub-Saharan Africa. That's because the Atlantic Ocean, for about the last 500 years, has been dominated by European traders. European traders here brought Christianity to the coasts. Arab traders here brought Islam, I should say, to the coast of the Indian Ocean. And then really the only ethnic polytheistic religion that shows up is Hinduism, which is the world's largest polytheistic ethnic religion, and it's practiced dominantly in India and all of those places where Indians have gone as immigrants, including the United States and a variety of other places.